The most powerful thing a soldier can do in war is decide where the line is and refuse to cross it. The truck rolled slowly along a narrow dirt road somewhere in northern Germany in the spring of 1945, its wooden sides rattling every time the wheels dropped into another rut. Inside the back sat a group of German women who had once lived ordinary lives. Farm workers, clerks, a nurse, a school assistant. But now they were prisoners of war, their coats pulled tight against the cold morning air. No one spoke at first. The only sounds were the truck engine, the wind slipping through the gaps in the boards, and the faint clatter of metal canteens from the British soldiers riding in front. Among the women sat Anna Weber, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She kept her eyes lowered, watching the floorboards vibrate with every mile. The war had already taken so much from everyone that expectations had become simple things. Safety was no longer one of them. During the long drive, whispers had passed from one end of the truck to the other, quiet enough that the soldiers outside could not hear. Rumors traveled fast in wartime. Stories about camps, about guards, about what sometimes happened to captured civilians when discipline faded and anger took its place. No one said the words clearly. They did not need to. Each woman carried the same silent question. What would happen when the truck stopped? Anna had heard the whispers too. She did not repeat them. She simply listened and watched the countryside slide by through a narrow crack in the wooden wall. Fields still gray from winter. A broken fence here and there. Smoke rising somewhere miles away. War had left its fingerprints on everything. After nearly 40 minutes, the truck slowed. Gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the engine dropped into a low growl before finally going quiet. The sudden silence felt louder than the drive itself. Several of the women straightened in their seats. Someone near the back quietly inhaled and held the breath as if bracing for cold water. Outside, boots hit the ground. One pair, then another. The sound was calm, unhurried. The rear latch clicked. For a moment, no one inside moved. The door swung open and daylight poured into the dark truck bed, forcing several of the women to squint. A few British soldiers stood several feet away, their uniforms dusty from the road, their expressions unreadable. One of them glanced inside, and then immediately looked away again, as if he were checking a list in his mind rather than studying the prisoners. No one reached forward. No one shouted. No one grabbed an arm or barked an order. The women waited, unsure if this pause was the calm before something worse. Then a tall officer stepped forward, removing one leather glove slowly as he approached the open gate. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and almost quiet. "All right," he said, looking not at their faces but somewhere just beyond them, as if giving space rather than taking it. "You'll step down one at a time. You're prisoners of war now, and you'll be treated accordingly." The words hung in the air for a second. Simple words. Ordinary words. But inside the truck something shifted, because none of the women had expected ordinary. Anna Weber was the third woman to step down from the truck. The wooden step creaked under her weight as her boots touched the gravel for the first time in hours. The air outside felt colder than it had inside the truck, sharp with the smell of damp earth and distant smoke. She kept her eyes lowered at first, just like the others. It was easier that way. Easier not to study the soldiers too closely. Easier not to guess what they might be thinking. One by one the women climbed down behind her. No one rushed them. No one grabbed their arms. A British soldier stood several feet away holding a clipboard, quietly marking something down each time another prisoner reached the ground. His pencil moved slowly, carefully, as if accuracy mattered more than speed. The officer who had spoken earlier remained near the truck, his posture straight but relaxed. Captain James Whitaker. Anna did not know his name yet, but she noticed the calm way he observed everything around him. Not like a man searching for weakness, more like someone making sure order remained in place. The women gathered together instinctively, standing shoulder to shoulder as if the closeness might offer protection. A cold breeze moved across the open yard of the camp, tugging lightly at coats and loose strands of hair. In the distance, a row of long wooden barracks stretched across the field, simple buildings, with pale windows reflecting the gray sky. Nothing about the place looked chaotic. That alone was strange. One of the women beside Anna whispered under her breath, asking what would happen next. No one answered. They all expected instructions, sharp commands, maybe shouting. Instead, another soldier approached carrying a wooden crate. He set it down on a small table near the group and opened the lid. Inside were metal cups. He began placing them in a neat line without saying a word. A second soldier followed with a large kettle that released thin trails of steam into the cold air. The scent of tea drifted slowly across the yard. Anna looked up for the first time. The simple act surprised her more than anything that had happened so far. The soldiers did not crowd the prisoners. They stayed several feet away, moving with quiet purpose, like men performing a routine they had done many times before. Captain Whitaker finally stepped closer, though he still kept a respectful distance between himself and the group. His voice carried easily through the cool morning air. He explained that they would be registered, given food, and assigned temporary quarters. His tone was steady, almost formal, as if he were addressing guests rather than defeated enemies. The women listened carefully, searching for some hidden edge in his words, some hint that kindness might suddenly disappear. But the edge never came. Anna noticed something else then. The soldiers avoided staring. When they passed near the group, their eyes shifted politely toward the ground or toward the table with the cups. It was a small detail, but it carried weight. The silence inside the truck had been heavy with fear. The silence here felt different. It felt deliberate, and for reasons Anna could not yet explain, that made the moment even harder to understand. The steam from the kettle drifted slowly into the gray morning air, curling upward before disappearing into the low clouds above the camp. Anna Weber watched it carefully, as if the thin white trails might reveal something about the men standing across the yard. War had taught people to read small signs. The way a man moved, the way he looked at others, the way he handled silence. A British soldier stepped forward and began placing metal cups along the table. His movements were slow and precise. When the line was finished, he lifted the kettle and filled each cup one by one. The faint sound of liquid touching metal carried softly through the cold air. No one rushed forward. The women remained where they stood, waiting for permission that had not yet been given. Captain James Whitaker noticed this hesitation immediately. He nodded once toward the table. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but it carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. One of the soldiers spoke gently, explaining that the tea was for them and that they could step forward. The words sounded almost strange to the women. For a moment no one moved. Finally Anna took a step. Her boots pressed into the damp gravel as she approached the table. She expected someone to stop her or inspect her closely. No one did. The soldier standing beside the kettle looked away slightly as she reached for a cup, giving her space as if the moment deserved privacy. The metal felt warm in her hands. The warmth surprised her more than the tea itself. She stepped back toward the group and lifted the cup carefully, letting the steam brush against her face. Around her the other women began moving as well, slowly forming a quiet line. The soldiers remained at a respectful distance, speaking only when necessary. No laughter, no comments, only calm instructions and patient silence. Anna studied the camp while she drank. The barracks in the distance looked simple but orderly. A narrow path of packed dirt ran between them, marked by footprints from earlier that morning. Beyond the buildings stood a wooden fence stretching across the field. 2 guards walked along it at an easy pace, their rifles resting on their shoulders, but their posture relaxed. Nothing about the scene felt rushed or unstable. It felt controlled, disciplined. That realization created a strange tension inside Anna. Fear was easier to understand than restraint. Cruelty was something people prepared for during war. But discipline like this raised a different question. It meant these soldiers were choosing their behavior. Near the truck, 2 younger British soldiers quietly lifted a crate and carried it toward one of the barracks. One of them said something under his breath, and the other responded with a short laugh, but the sound faded quickly as they noticed the prisoners watching. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by the same calm professionalism the others had shown from the beginning. Anna lowered her cup slightly. She noticed how often the soldiers avoided direct eye contact with the women. Not from shame, from intention, as if someone had made it clear that certain boundaries would never be crossed inside this camp. She glanced again toward Captain Whitaker. He stood near the truck with his hands behind his back, scanning the yard quietly. His expression revealed almost nothing, but there was something unmistakable in the way the other soldiers carried themselves around him. They were not simply following orders. They were following a standard. And in that moment Anna realized something that unsettled her more than the long ride to the camp. These men were not holding themselves back because they had to. They were doing it because they had decided to. The tea warmed Anna Weber's hands long after the steam had begun to fade. Around her, the other women drank slowly, carefully, as if they were afraid that moving too quickly might break whatever fragile balance existed inside the camp. War had taught them that calm moments could disappear without warning. Yet minutes passed, and nothing changed. The British soldiers continued their work with the same quiet discipline. One man carried folded blankets from a storage shed near the barracks. Another adjusted a stack of wooden crates beside the registration table. A third soldier walked across the yard holding a clipboard, occasionally glancing down to check the names written on the page. None of them raised their voices. None of them approached the women closer than necessary. Anna noticed how deliberate every movement seemed to be. It was not the careless calm of men who were relaxed. It was the controlled calm of men who understood exactly where they stood. Captain James Whitaker remained near the center of the yard, watching the routine unfold. From time to time, a soldier approached him with a short question. The conversations were brief and professional. A nod, a few quiet words. Then the soldier returned to his task. The pattern repeated itself again and again, like a machine designed to keep order running smoothly. One of the women standing beside Anna leaned closer and whispered that this felt strange. Her voice carried the confusion that many of them felt but had not yet spoken aloud. The woman said that she had expected shouting, anger, maybe humiliation. Instead there was only structure and silence. Anna did not answer immediately. She kept her eyes on the soldiers across the yard. A young British guard had just walked past the group on his way toward the fence line. As he passed, he shifted slightly to the side so that his shoulder would not brush against any of the prisoners. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Anna noticed it clearly. The guard did not look at them as he passed. He simply continued walking, his boots crunching steadily on the gravel path. That small gesture unsettled her more than anything else she had seen. Not because it was rude, but because it was careful. It suggested that someone had made a rule here, and that the rule mattered. Near the barracks, another soldier opened the door of a wooden building and began placing several blankets on a long bench just inside the entrance. The interior looked simple but clean. Light from the cloudy sky filtered through the windows, revealing rows of narrow bunks along the walls. Captain Whitaker stepped forward again, his voice carrying across the yard with the same steady tone. He explained that the women would be escorted to the barracks shortly and that they would receive food within the hour. The instructions were clear and calm. When he finished speaking, he paused for a moment, scanning the group as if measuring their reactions. Anna met his eyes briefly before looking away again. In that short moment, she noticed something that had been present since the truck arrived but had been difficult to define. The officer was not watching them with suspicion. He was watching his own men. And slowly Anna began to understand that the quiet order surrounding them did not exist by accident. It existed because one man in that camp had decided exactly how this moment would unfold. The last of the tea had grown lukewarm when the routine in the yard shifted again. A British corporal approached Captain James Whitaker with a small notebook in his hand. They spoke quietly for a few seconds, their voices low enough that the prisoners could not hear the words. Whitaker listened without interrupting. When the corporal finished, the officer gave a short nod and glanced across the yard toward the row of barracks. The movement was small, but it carried weight. Within moments, two soldiers walked toward the women, stopping several feet away just as the others had done all morning. One of them spoke in a calm, clear voice. He explained that they would now be escorted to their temporary quarters. The women could carry their cups to the table when they finished. Nothing more was required. No one was rushed. Anna Weber watched carefully as the instructions were given. She noticed how the soldier stood with his hands behind his back rather than folded across his chest. His posture felt less like control and more like restraint. Around her, the other women exchanged uncertain glances. Some of them finished the last sip of tea quickly, as if eager to move before something changed. Others held their cups a little longer, reluctant to break the strange quiet that had settled over the camp. Anna placed her empty cup on the table and stepped back beside the group. The sky above remained heavy with clouds, the pale light giving the entire camp a muted color. Somewhere beyond the fence, a crow called out once before flying across the field. The sound echoed briefly and then faded. Captain Whitaker began walking toward the barracks, not quickly, simply at a steady pace that suggested the others should follow. Two soldiers moved to either side of the group, but kept the same respectful distance they had maintained since the truck arrived. Anna noticed that they walked slightly ahead rather than behind, guiding the direction without crowding the prisoners. Gravel crunched beneath their boots as the group crossed the open yard. The barracks door stood open, revealing the long wooden room inside. The scent of fresh pine boards mixed with the faint smell of soap. Someone had cleaned the space recently. Rows of narrow bunks lined the walls, each one holding a folded blanket placed neatly at the foot of the mattress. Sunlight pushed through the tall windows in thin gray beams that stretched across the wooden floor. The room felt plain but orderly, like a place meant for rest rather than punishment. One by one the women stepped inside. A soldier pointed toward the bunks and explained that they could choose any open bed. He spoke slowly, making sure the words were understood. Anna paused near the doorway for a moment before entering. From that position, she could see the entire yard behind them. Captain Whitaker remained outside, standing near the path with his hands behind his back again. His eyes moved across the camp, watching the guards, the fences, the soldiers carrying supplies. Not once did he step closer to the women as they entered the building. Not once did he follow them inside. Anna turned toward the empty bunks, but the image of the officer standing alone in the yard stayed in her mind. War had taught her to expect many things from soldiers. Control, anger, pride. But what she was seeing here felt different. It felt like something quieter, something chosen. And as she stepped deeper into the barracks, Anna began to realize that the true rules of this camp were not written on any sign or spoken in any command. They existed inside the decisions of one man who believed that even in war, some lines were never meant to be crossed. Anna Weber chose a bunk near the window. The mattress was thin but clean, and the folded blanket at the foot of the bed carried the faint smell of soap and fresh fabric. She placed her hands on the wooden frame for a moment before sitting down, testing the weight carefully, as if the bed might disappear if she trusted it too quickly. Around her the other women moved slowly through the barracks, each one choosing a bunk with quiet hesitation. Some placed their coats down first. Others sat without speaking, their eyes moving around the room as though they were still trying to understand what kind of place this was. The long building held perhaps 20 bunks along each wall, all evenly spaced, all prepared the same way. Nothing felt temporary or careless. Even the floor had been swept clean, the boards showing faint lines where a broom had passed earlier that morning. Anna looked toward the windows. Outside, the yard remained calm. A pair of British soldiers walked along the fenced line in the distance, their steps slow and steady as they followed the same path back and forth. Near the supply shed another soldier carried a stack of folded blankets toward a neighboring building. The entire camp seemed to move according to quiet routines that had already been established long before the prisoners arrived. One of the women across the room finally spoke in a low voice, asking if anyone believed this calm would last. No one answered immediately. War had taught people not to trust the first impression of anything. Still, the room itself carried a strange kind of peace. The soft sound of boots outside the building, the occasional creak of wood as someone shifted on a bunk, the distant clink of metal from the yard. These were ordinary sounds, the kind people once heard in quiet places before the war had changed everything. Anna leaned back slightly and studied the room again. She noticed a narrow table placed near the door with a pitcher of water and several tin cups beside it. A small iron stove stood in the far corner, its surface dark but polished from regular use. Someone had prepared this space carefully. That thought stayed with her. It meant the arrival of prisoners had been expected, planned for, organized with intention. Footsteps approached the barracks door again. The women inside grew quiet immediately, their eyes turning toward the entrance. A British soldier appeared in the doorway holding a small stack of folded cloth in his arms. He paused just inside the room, clearly aware that every pair of eyes was watching him. Without stepping any farther forward, he placed the cloth neatly on the table near the water pitcher. They were additional blankets. After setting them down, he spoke in the same calm voice the others had used all morning. He explained that food would arrive soon and that they should rest for now if they wished. Then he gave a small nod and stepped back outside, leaving the door open behind him. The moment he disappeared, the room remained silent for several seconds. Anna realized that the silence felt different from the fear she had expected during the long ride to the camp. This silence carried uncertainty, but it also carried something else that had been missing for a very long time. Space. The soldiers were giving them space to breathe, to think, to exist without pressure. Anna lay back on the narrow mattress and looked up at the wooden beams crossing the ceiling above her. She thought again about the officer standing in the yard earlier that morning, the way he had watched his men more carefully than he had watched the prisoners. Slowly she began to understand that what was happening inside this camp was not simply discipline. It was a choice being repeated over and over again by every soldier who walked through those gates. The quiet inside the barracks slowly began to settle into something that almost felt normal. Anna Weber remained on the narrow bunk near the window, her hands folded over the blanket as she listened to the faint sounds drifting in from the yard outside. Boots crossing gravel, a door closing somewhere in the distance, the low murmur of soldiers speaking to one another as they carried out their duties. None of the sounds carried anger. None carried urgency. They were simply the sounds of men working through another day. Across the room, two of the women sat close together, speaking in careful whispers. Another woman had already stretched out on her bunk, staring at the ceiling beams as if trying to remember what it felt like to rest without expecting to be interrupted. The entire room held that same cautious stillness. People were waiting for the moment when everything would change. War had trained them to expect that moment. Anna turned her head slightly toward the open doorway. From her position, she could see a narrow slice of the camp outside. The cloudy sky hung low over the field, the light pale and soft against the wooden buildings. A British guard passed by the door carrying a wooden crate. His steps slowed briefly when he noticed the women watching from inside the barracks. Instead of staring back, he shifted his eyes toward the path ahead and continued walking. The small gesture caught Anna's attention again. It was the same quiet restraint she had noticed earlier in the yard. A decision repeated in simple movements. After several minutes, another set of footsteps approached the doorway. This time the sound was heavier, steady but unhurried. Captain James Whitaker appeared at the entrance and paused just outside the threshold. He did not step inside. His posture remained straight, his hands resting calmly behind his back as he looked into the room. The women noticed him immediately. Conversation stopped. Several of them sat up straighter on their bunks. Whitaker spoke in the same, even voice he had used in the yard earlier that morning. He explained that food was being prepared and would arrive shortly. Bread, soup, and water. Simple things, but enough for everyone. He also explained that a medical officer would visit later in the afternoon to check on anyone who needed assistance. The information was delivered without drama, almost like a routine announcement. When he finished speaking, he paused, giving the women time to absorb the words. One of them finally asked a quiet question from the far side of the room. She asked why they were being treated this way. The question carried no accusation, only confusion. Whitaker remained silent for a moment before answering. His eyes moved across the room slowly, not studying faces but acknowledging the presence of every person there. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm. He said that they were prisoners of war and that prisoners of war had rights. Nothing more. The simplicity of the explanation lingered in the air. Anna watched him carefully as he spoke those words. There was no pride in his tone and no attempt to impress anyone. It sounded less like a speech and more like a rule he had already decided long before this moment. After a few seconds, Whitaker gave a small nod, almost as if the conversation had reached its natural end. Then he stepped back from the doorway and continued down the path outside the barracks. The room remained quiet long after he disappeared from view. Anna leaned back against the wooden wall beside her bunk and stared at the open doorway again. The officer had not entered the room. He had not needed to. Whatever standard guided this camp was already understood by the men who served there. And slowly the women inside the barracks were beginning to understand it too. The question the woman had asked continued to linger in the room long after Captain James Whitaker's footsteps faded from the path outside. Prisoners of war had rights. The sentence was simple, almost plain, but it echoed quietly through the barracks as the women considered what it meant. Anna Weber remained seated near the window, her eyes following the thin strip of gray sky visible through the glass. The clouds had not moved much since morning. Time seemed to pass differently inside the camp, measured less by clocks and more by the rhythm of quiet routines. Across the room, one of the women slowly folded her coat and placed it at the foot of her bunk, copying the neat order she had seen in the blankets. Another woman stood beside the narrow table, and poured water into one of the tin cups, her hands moving carefully as though the simple act required permission. No one rushed. No one argued. The stillness had begun to shape the room in ways that felt unfamiliar. Outside the barracks, the sound of boots approached again, followed by the soft rattle of metal containers being carried across gravel. Anna shifted slightly on her bunk and leaned closer to the window. Through the glass, she saw two British soldiers walking toward the building, each holding the handle of a large pot suspended between them on a metal rod. Steam rose from the lid as they moved, twisting into the cold air before fading away. A third soldier followed behind them carrying a wooden crate filled with round loaves of bread. Their pace remained steady, careful not to spill the contents they carried. When they reached the barracks door, they paused briefly, adjusting their grip before stepping inside. The warm scent of soup entered the room immediately, spreading slowly through the air. It was a simple smell, made from vegetables and broth, but after the long journey it felt almost overwhelming. One of the soldiers placed the pot carefully on the table beside the water pitcher, while the other lifted the crate of bread and set it beside it. Neither man stepped farther into the room than necessary. One of them explained that everyone would receive a portion and that there was enough for all of them. His voice held the same calm tone the women had heard since arriving at the camp. Anna watched closely as the food was distributed. Each woman approached the table, received a piece of bread and a cup of soup, and then stepped aside to allow the next person forward. The soldiers waited patiently beside the table, making sure no one was overlooked. At one point, a loaf slipped from the crate and rolled gently across the floorboards. The nearest soldier bent down immediately to pick it up, brushing away a bit of dust before placing it back with the others. The small act drew a few quiet glances from the women nearby. Nothing about the moment felt careless. When Anna reached the table, she accepted her portion with a small nod. The soup warmed her hands through the metal cup, just as the tea had earlier in the yard. She returned to her bunk and sat down slowly, tasting the broth for the first time. It was plain but steady, the kind of food meant to restore strength rather than impress anyone. Around the room, the same quiet scene repeated itself as the women ate. Outside the window, the camp continued its steady rhythm. Guards walked the fence line. Soldiers carried supplies between buildings. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed with a soft wooden thud. Anna lowered the cup slightly and looked once more toward the open doorway. Everything she had seen since arriving pointed to the same quiet truth. The calm inside this camp was not temporary kindness. It was the result of a line that the men here had chosen not to cross. The warmth of the soup slowly spread through the barracks, softening the sharp edge of the cold morning that had followed the women since the truck first stopped outside the camp. Anna Weber held the metal cup with both hands, letting the heat settle into her fingers while she watched the quiet movement around the room. Across the wooden floor, the other women ate slowly, some sitting on their bunks while others remained standing near the walls. The sound of spoons touching the sides of metal cups echoed gently through the space, blending with the distant noises from the yard outside. For the first time since arriving, the room carried the faint rhythm of people doing something ordinary. Eating, resting, breathing without waiting for the next command. Anna lifted the cup again and tasted the broth. It was simple vegetable soup, thin but warm, the kind prepared in large pots meant to feed many people at once. She noticed that each portion had been poured carefully, the levels inside the cups nearly identical. Even the bread had been divided with the same attention. Nothing felt rushed or careless. The soldiers who had delivered the food still stood near the table, quietly watching to make sure every woman received her share. They did not stare, and they did not speak unless someone approached them directly. One of the women stepped forward to ask for water, and the nearest soldier moved the pitcher closer to the edge of the table so she could reach it easily without stepping too near him. The gesture was small, but it carried the same pattern Anna had noticed since morning. Distance, respect, intention. Outside the window, the sky remained heavy with gray clouds, though the light had grown slightly brighter as the day moved toward afternoon. A pair of guards passed along the fence line again, their pace steady as they followed the same path back and forth. Anna realized that she had begun to recognize individual movements among the soldiers. The way one guard adjusted the strap of his rifle before turning at the corner of the fence. The way another paused near the supply shed to speak briefly with a man carrying a stack of crates. Each action looked familiar now, as though the camp had settled into a routine that repeated hour after hour. Across the room, one of the women finished her soup and set the empty cup carefully on the floor beside her bunk. She looked toward Anna and spoke in a quiet voice, wondering aloud how long the calm would last. The question drifted across the room, drawing a few thoughtful glances from the others. Anna did not answer immediately. She simply watched the doorway where the soldiers had entered earlier with the food. The door remained open, allowing the cool air from outside to mix with the warmth of the barracks. Beyond that doorway, the camp continued its steady rhythm. After a moment, one of the soldiers stepped forward to collect the empty pot from the table. As he lifted it, the metal lid shifted slightly and released the last thin ribbon of steam into the room. The soldier adjusted the lid and turned toward the door, but before leaving he glanced back once more to make sure nothing had been forgotten. Then he carried the pot outside without another word. Anna lowered her cup slowly. The quiet professionalism of the moment felt almost unreal compared to the stories she had heard during the long journey to the camp. Those stories had prepared the women for cruelty, for anger, for humiliation. Instead, they had found something else entirely. Discipline that did not need to announce itself. Restraint that appeared again and again in the smallest details. Anna leaned back against the wooden wall beside her bunk and looked once more through the window toward the yard. Somewhere out there, Captain James Whitaker continued walking the same paths between the buildings, watching his men with the same calm attention he had shown since morning. And the more Anna observed the steady order of the camp, the more she realized that the greatest surprise was not what the soldiers had done. It was what they had deliberately chosen not to do. Afternoon settled slowly over the camp, the gray sky growing a little brighter as thin light filtered through the clouds. Inside the barracks, the warmth from the soup had faded, leaving behind the quiet stillness that had defined the entire day. Anna Weber sat near the window with the empty cup resting beside her on the wooden bunk. Around her, the other women had begun to relax in small ways that would have been impossible only hours earlier. One woman had removed her coat and folded it carefully beside her blanket. Another had leaned back against the wall, her eyes closed as if testing whether sleep might finally come. The air inside the building carried the faint scent of bread and broth, mixed with the clean smell of wood that had been recently scrubbed. Outside the window, the camp continued its calm routine. Soldiers crossed the yard carrying supplies between buildings. A pair of guards walked the fence line again, their steps measured and familiar now. Anna realized she could almost predict where they would appear next along the path. The repetition created a strange sense of stability, something the women had not felt in a very long time. After a while, the barracks door opened again. A British soldier stepped inside, this time accompanied by another man wearing a small medical satchel across his shoulder. The second man introduced himself as the camp doctor. His voice was gentle and steady as he explained that he would check on anyone who felt ill or injured. The announcement caused a quiet stir among the women. Some of them exchanged uncertain glances. Medical visits during wartime had not always meant comfort. Yet the doctor remained near the doorway rather than walking directly into the room. He waited patiently while the women decided whether they wished to approach him. One by one, a few of them stepped forward. The doctor spoke with each person calmly, asking simple questions and offering basic care when needed. A small bandage was wrapped around a hand that had been scraped during the journey. Another woman received a small bottle of tablets for a lingering cough. The entire process unfolded with the same quiet respect that had guided everything else inside the camp. Anna watched carefully from her bunk. She noticed how the soldiers near the door gave the doctor space to work without hovering over the women. They stood a few steps away, their attention directed toward the yard outside rather than the conversations taking place in the room. Once again, the same invisible line seemed to guide every movement. After the doctor finished his rounds, he thanked the women politely and stepped back outside. The soldier beside him closed the door halfway, leaving a small opening for fresh air. The room grew quiet again as the footsteps faded down the path. Anna leaned slightly toward the window and looked out across the camp. In the distance, she spotted Captain James Whitaker standing near the supply shed, speaking with one of the guards. The conversation appeared brief. Whitaker listened, nodded once, and then continued walking along the path that ran between the barracks. His pace remained calm and unhurried, the same steady rhythm he had shown since the moment the truck arrived. Anna followed his movement until he disappeared behind another building. A thought slowly formed in her mind as she watched the camp continue its careful routine. The soldiers here were not behaving differently by accident. They were following an example that had been set clearly from the beginning. Every cup of tea, every loaf of bread, every respectful step backward when passing a prisoner had come from the same quiet decision. And as the afternoon light spread across the wooden buildings of the camp, Anna understood that the most surprising part of this place was not the rules that existed. It was the discipline required to keep those rules unbroken. The afternoon light stretched slowly across the wooden floor of the barracks, forming long pale lines beneath the narrow bunks. Anna Weber sat quietly near the window, her back resting against the wall as she watched the soft movement of shadows shifting across the room. The calm that had filled the camp throughout the day had begun to settle deeper into the space, like a steady rhythm that no one was trying to disturb. Some of the women had laid down on their bunks, their breathing slow and even. Others sat upright, speaking in low voices that barely carried beyond the nearest bed. The fear that had traveled with them inside the truck that morning had not disappeared completely, but it had changed shape. Now it was mixed with something else. Curiosity. Across the room, one of the women approached the small table again and filled a tin cup with water from the pitcher. She drank slowly, then placed the cup back beside the others with careful precision. Every action inside the room seemed deliberate, as though the quiet discipline outside had slowly entered the building itself. Anna turned her head toward the window again. Outside, the sky had shifted from pale gray to a slightly brighter shade, the clouds thinning enough for a faint glow of afternoon light to spread across the camp. Soldiers moved along the paths between the barracks with the same steady pace they had kept all day. A guard paused near the fence line, adjusting the strap across his shoulder before continuing his patrol. Near the supply shed, 2 men stacked wooden crates beside the door, while another checked a list on a clipboard. Everything happened with calm coordination. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. After several minutes, the barracks door opened once more. A young British soldier stepped inside, carrying a small bundle of folded cloth. He stopped near the entrance and placed the bundle on the table beside the water pitcher. The cloths were simple towels, clean and neatly folded. He explained quietly that they had been provided for washing if anyone wished to use them. His voice held the same respectful tone the women had heard since arriving. When he finished speaking, he gave a brief nod and stepped back outside without waiting for a response. The door remained open behind him, allowing the cooler air to drift into the room again. Anna watched the cloths on the table for a moment. Even this small gesture followed the same pattern she had observed all day. No one forced the women to move. No one entered their space unnecessarily. The soldiers offered what was needed and then stepped back. Time continued to pass slowly. Somewhere outside, a metal bucket struck lightly against a wooden post, producing a soft ringing sound that echoed across the yard before fading away. Anna leaned forward slightly and rested her elbows on her knees, her eyes drifting once more toward the open doorway. After a few minutes, a familiar figure appeared along the path outside the barracks. Captain James Whitaker walked past the building with the same calm stride he had shown since morning. His gaze moved across the camp, briefly checking each corner of the yard as though confirming that everything remained exactly as it should be. For a moment he slowed near the barracks entrance, glancing toward the open door without stepping inside. Then he continued down the path, disappearing behind the neighboring building. Anna watched until he was gone. The officer had not spoken. He had not needed to. The quiet standard that guided the camp had already been set, and every soldier seemed to understand it clearly. As Anna leaned back against the wall again, she realized something that would have been impossible to imagine during the long drive earlier that morning. In a place built to hold prisoners of war, the strongest force shaping the day had not been fear. It had been restraint. The afternoon slowly leaned toward evening, and the light inside the barracks softened into a pale golden gray that spread across the wooden walls. Anna Weber remained near the window, her posture relaxed in a way that had not been possible earlier that morning. The camp outside continued to move with the same steady rhythm, but now the sounds felt almost familiar. Boots crossing gravel, a distant door closing, the quiet murmur of soldiers speaking somewhere beyond the neighboring buildings. None of it carried tension. None of it carried the sharp edge of uncertainty that had followed the women during their long journey. Across the room, several of the women had begun speaking more openly. Their voices were still low, but the conversations lasted longer now, no longer ending the moment footsteps approached the door. One woman carefully unfolded the towel that had been left earlier and placed it beside the water pitcher, preparing to wash her hands. Another sat cross-legged on her bunk, brushing dust from the hem of her coat. Small, ordinary movements slowly returned to the room, as if the body itself was remembering how to exist without constant fear. Anna watched these quiet changes with thoughtful attention. She knew that trust did not appear suddenly. It arrived in small pieces, often carried by simple moments that repeated themselves again and again. The camp had offered many of those moments since morning. A cup of tea placed on a table without a demand. A loaf of bread divided evenly among strangers. A doctor who waited at the doorway instead of stepping inside uninvited. Each action had built something invisible but steady between the prisoners and the soldiers guarding them. Outside the window, the clouds began to break slightly, allowing a thin strip of fading sunlight to reach the open yard. The light stretched across the fence and the wooden barracks, catching the edges of the gravel path where the soldiers continued their patrols. Anna noticed Captain James Whitaker again as he walked along the far side of the yard, speaking briefly with one of the guards before continuing on his way. His presence seemed to anchor the quiet discipline that held the camp together. Even from a distance, it was clear that the men around him understood exactly what was expected of them. Not through loud commands, through example. Anna leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees as she watched the officer disappear behind another building. Her thoughts returned to the moment earlier in the day when one of the women had asked why they were being treated this way. The answer Whitaker had given had been simple. Prisoners of war had rights. At the time, the explanation had felt almost too brief, too direct for the weight of the question. But now, after hours inside the camp, Anna began to understand that the sentence had carried a deeper meaning. It was not simply a rule written somewhere in a document. It was a choice repeated again and again by the men who served there. The barracks grew quieter as evening approached. Some of the women stretched out on their bunks, finally allowing their eyes to close. Others remained awake, watching the fading light through the windows just as Anna did. The world outside the camp still carried the uncertainty of a war that had not fully ended. But inside these wooden walls, a different kind of strength had revealed itself throughout the day. Not the strength of force or control, the strength of restraint. Anna slowly leaned back against the wall once more, her gaze resting on the open doorway where the cool evening air drifted gently into the room. And in that quiet moment, she understood something that would stay with her long after the war itself faded into memory. Sometimes the clearest sign of power was not what a person chose to do. It was what they deliberately refused to become. Morning arrived quietly over the camp, the pale light of early day sliding across the wooden walls of the barracks as if the world itself were moving carefully, unwilling to disturb the fragile calm that had formed overnight. Anna Weber opened her eyes slowly, aware first of the silence. For a brief moment, she did not remember where she was. Then the shape of the bunk above her, the faint smell of wood and soap, and the distant sound of boots on gravel returned to her mind. She sat up and noticed that several of the other women were already awake. Some remained seated on their bunks, watching the windows with thoughtful expressions, while others moved quietly around the small room. The tension that had filled the air on their first arrival had softened into something more measured. No one spoke loudly, yet the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt patient. Outside the window, a cool morning mist drifted slowly across the open yard, blurring the fence line and the row of neighboring buildings. A pair of British soldiers crossed the gravel path carrying wooden crates toward a supply shed nearly 40 yards away. Their movements were steady and unhurried, as if the routine of the camp followed the same predictable rhythm each day. Anna noticed that neither man looked toward the barracks window. It was a small detail, but she had begun to recognize the pattern behind it. The guards did not stare. They did not linger. They simply continued with their duties. One of the women, named Greta, stepped closer to the window beside Anna and folded her arms loosely. She watched the yard for several seconds before speaking in a quiet voice. She said that the morning looked peaceful. Anna nodded slightly. The word peaceful felt unusual in a place surrounded by fences and soldiers, yet it was the most accurate description she could find. A short time later the barracks door opened, and a young British corporal appeared carrying a metal container that released the faint smell of warm tea. He paused just inside the doorway and explained in careful German that breakfast would be brought shortly. His voice remained calm and respectful. When he finished speaking, he placed several tin cups on the small wooden table near the center of the room and stepped back outside, closing the door gently behind him. The women exchanged glances. Greta lifted one of the cups and examined it for a moment before pouring tea from the container. Steam rose slowly into the cool air of the room. Anna wrapped her hands around the warm metal and felt the heat spread into her fingers. It was such a simple sensation, yet it carried a quiet reassurance. Beyond the walls of the barracks, the camp was fully awake now. Voices traveled through the mist along with the distant rumble of a truck engine somewhere beyond the fence line. Anna moved back to the window and watched as Captain James Whitaker appeared again along the far side of the yard. He stopped to speak with a guard near the main gate, gesturing briefly toward a clipboard before continuing along the path. The officer walked with the same calm confidence she had noticed the day before. Nothing in his manner suggested fear or anger, only responsibility. Anna followed his figure until he disappeared behind another row of buildings. As the morning light slowly strengthened across the camp, she realized that something inside the barracks had shifted once again. The women were no longer waiting for something terrible to happen. Instead, they were beginning to observe, to understand, and quietly to believe that the strange sense of dignity they had witnessed since arriving might not disappear after all.